Hi, I'm Rebecca Ball-Carcel. Let's find out where the sonnet comes from. The sonnet, being one of the most popular forms in the English language, you might think started with Shakespeare, but it didn't. It actually started in Italy with a guy named Francesco Petrach, and Shakespeare picked it up a couple hundred years later. Let's find out more. Frank in Love, and how it led to the most famous of poem forms, the sonnet. Frank is my pet name for Francesco, of course, and we will see how love is what inspired him to be so prolific with his sonnet writing. So here we have Francesco, born in 1304, a couple hundred years before Shakespeare, and in a letter he wrote to posterity, he talked about his early life, and he mentions his schooling. He says, "I learned as much of grammar, logic, and rhetoric as my age permitted, or rather, as much as it is customary to teach in school. How little that is, dear reader, thou knowest." And this is funny because obviously he thinks he didn't learn all that much in school, and we today can sometimes relate. Now, young Francesco was pretty promising, and everybody thought, wow, he could be something like a lawyer. And so he started to study law. He says, "I then set out to study law. I heard the whole body of the civil law, and would, as many thought, have distinguished myself later, had I but continued my studies." Now he's going to explain why he gave up studying law. "I gave up the subject altogether, however, so soon as it was no longer necessary to consult the wishes of my parents. My reason was that, although the dignity of the law, which is doubtless very great, I felt it to be habitually degraded by those who practiced it." So like now, sometimes lawyers were doing unscrupulous things, and he did not want to go along with that. He said, "It went against me painfully to acquire an art which I would not practice dishonestly, and could hardly hope to exercise otherwise." That means that he knew successful lawyers had to be dishonest, and therefore he just couldn't do it. He goes on, "Had I made the latter attempt, my scrupulousness would doubtless have been ascribed to simplicity." He means that if he had tried to be an honest lawyer, people would have thought he was stupid, that he was simple, and so this was not going to work at all. He says, "At the age of 22, I returned home." Well, now what's he going to do? Well, let's go back to the idea of the church. It turns out that his father was the one who wanted him to be a lawyer, and his father died, so he was able to go to his first love, which was the church. In 4 years, he completed the minor orders, and he becomes a diplomat for the church. That means he wasn't a priest, but rather he would go around and broker peace treaties and stuff like that. Now, this job as diplomat allowed him to travel around quite a bit, and he was in France when something very important happened. Young Petrarch, early 20s, is sitting in church when suddenly he sees Laura. So as the historian Peter Sadlin puts it, it's April 6, 1327, Good Friday, at an Easter Mass when Petrarch sees Laura for the first time. Now, we don't really know who Laura even was, so we have a bit of a mystery here. It could be that she is Laura de Noves, who would have been born in 1310, but unfortunately was already married by the time Petrarch meets her. So if it's that Laura, then his love is never going to be requited. That means it's never going to be returned, and he'll have to love from afar. We're not even sure that he ever even talked to her, but he certainly fell in love with her, and he would go on to write hundreds of poems to her, which in years to come would be shared as people took them around the world. They were translated into every known language of the time. They became very popular. One of the reasons for this popularity is probably that everyone can relate to love at first sight. Laura is 17 when she meets Petrarch, or sees him, or really he sees her at Mass when they're at church. And here's the actual remains of the church today in Avignon, which is again in France. Some nice Gothic architecture there. And here is another portrait of Laura and more remains of the church there, and the little plaque that announces in French that this is the place where Laura and Petrarch met. It even talks about their immortal love, and it's immortal because the sonnets have preserved their love forever. Here we see the building as it is today. It's a theater, and you can still see some of the archways and windows that look kind of church-like, but it is now in use as a performance space. So the drama of great love can continue on stage. Petrarch eventually writes 366 poems about Laura, 317 of them being sonnets. Now he collects them all together and he calls the group canzoniere, which means songs, like canción in Spanish means song. Critic Robert Stanley Martin writes that Petrarch reimagined the conventions of love poetry in the most profound way. Love for the idealized lady was the path towards learning how to properly love God. Notice how in this painting we see Laura appearing before Petrarch almost like an angel, and of course we have Cupid as well, about to shoot him with an arrow of love. But the attitude he has toward her is quite reverent, is worshipful, and it's through loving a woman that a man can purify his soul and discover divine love. Here we see Petrarch depicted with a portrait of Laura, which is on the right. With a pen in his hand, he reclines, leaning back toward her, looking to her for inspiration. He also seems to be in an attitude of ecstasy, hoping that looking at her will inspire a new poem. Now, Petrarch wrote a sonnet that captures the moment when he first met Laura. He talks about how there was an eclipse that day, and then goes on to say how love attacked him, but he did not defend himself. It was on that day, when the sun's ray was darkened in pity for its maker, that I was captured, and did not defend myself, because your lovely eyes had bound me, lady. It did not seem to me to be a time to guard myself against love's blows, so I went on confident, unsuspecting. From that my troubles started amongst the public sorrows. Love discovered me all weaponless, and opened the way to the heart through the eyes, which are made the passageways and doors of tears. So that it seems to me it does him little honor to wound me with his arrow in that state, he not showing his bow at all to you, who are armed. So he's referring to Cupid here, who is able to wound Petrarch with his arrow, but Laura is not going to be hurt by the arrow because she is armed. There's some kind of defense that she has against this love and this arrow of Cupid. But he is weaponless, and his eyes are the way that the love has managed to enter, because he sees her and is so struck and moved by her that he does indeed fall in love. Now let's get ready to look at the structure of this poem. You notice how it has a stanza of 4 lines, and then another 4 lines, and then we have 2 sets of 3. So basically we have a set of 8 and a set of 6. And this is typical for what's now called the Petrarchan sonnet. So we have in most Petrarchan sonnets that octave, which is the set of 8 lines, and then a sestet, which is a set of 6 lines. Now remember your root words, and you know that oct means 8 and ses means 6. There's also a rhyme pattern, A-B-B-A, A-B-B-A, in the octave. So that means we might have it something like nation, fair, care, station for the first set, and the same sounds again for the second set. Now for the sestet, we move into some new sounds, and we label those C, D, the C sound, the D sound, and there'll be an alternating of C, D, C, D, or even a 5th sound might come in, C, D, E, C, D, E. In any case, we have 14 lines total, and there's a turn at the 9th line. So after the octave, we get what's called a volta, which is a shift in the poem, and this is usually the point where the poet starts to really make an interesting point. The whole thing will be in a particular rhythm. It's called iambic pentameter, which means that it's in a rhythm that goes like this. Da-da, 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 da-da. So let's look at another example. This is Sonnet 292, You can see the purple part is the octave, the brown is the sestet, and the volta is marked with the brown arrow. I'll just read it. The eyes I spoke of once in words that burn, the arms and hands and feet and lovely face that took me from myself for such a space of time and marked me out from other men. The waving hair of unmixed gold that shone, the smile that flashed with the angelic rays that used to make this earth a paradise, are now a little dust, all feeling gone. And yet, now this is the volta, right? Because yet always signals a change. Everything that has come before has described the beautiful lover. However, she's died because all of her hair and eyes and so on are now dust, and the feeling from them is gone. So the lover has died, and yet he remains. So the sestet is going to talk about that. And yet I live, grief and disdain to me, left where the light I cherished never shows, in fragile bark on the tempestuous sea. Here let my loving song come to a close, the vein of my accustomed art is dry, and this, my lyre, turned at last to tears. This is so sad. He compares himself to a bark, which is a boat, on a stormy sea. He says, my loving song, the poem, is going to have to come to a close because the inspiration for it, this vein, is now dry. And this, my lyre, meaning poetry itself and poem writing, has turned to tears. Now let's take a closer look at the rhythm that Petrarch uses. It's called iambic pentameter. Don't let the word scare you. Penta means 5, so you have 5 of something. Meter means rhythm, so it just means we have a rhythm that uses 5 of something, and what the something is IAMBS. So one IAM would be a da-da, and 5 of them go da-da, da-da, da-dum, da-dum, da-dum. We have an unstressed syllable followed by a stressed one. Until I finish this, I'll stay awake. There's an example. Let's feel it in our bodies by using a snap clap 5 times. So it goes like this: snap clap, snap clap, snap clap, snap clap, snap clap. Until I finish this, I'll stay awake. That'll help you feel the rhythm physically, and then you can sense it in the poem as you read it. Now let's take a look at some conventions. That means some typical themes that Petrarch uses in his poems, and then afterwards everybody else uses in their sonnets too. Courtly love for an unattainable lady is common in many sonnets, as in particular Petrarch. Love is horribly painful. The angelic lady is cruel in rejecting the poet's love. Love is a religion whose practice ennobles the lover, making it sort of a spiritual practice. Love at first sight appears in many sonnets. Christian and classical, which means Greek, imagery coexist. So we have both, references to, say, Mary, the mother of Jesus, as well as Hera or Aphrodite. Cupid is cruel and powerful. The poet is at war with himself and has internal struggles. These are typical of Petrarch's sonnets, and later sonnet writers, sonneteers, will use the sonnet to explore those same themes, even as they use different words. Eventually, Laura dies, and Petrarch writes on the flyleaf of a favorite book, which is written by Virgil. He says, Laura, who was distinguished by her own virtues and widely celebrated by my songs, first appeared to my eyes in my early manhood, in the year of our Lord 1327, upon the 6th day of April, at the first hour, in the church of Santa Clara, Avignon. So that's when he saw her for the first time. In the same city, in the same month of April, on the same 6th day, at the same first hour, in the year 1348, that light was taken from our day, while I was by chance in Verona, ignorant, alas, of my fate. So when he says that light was taken, he means that Laura was taken, and he happened to be in Verona, which is where Shakespeare chose to set Romeo and Juliet, where it takes place. So that's kind of interesting. Poor Petrarch. Now the question of who Petrarch's Laura really was continues unanswered to this day. It might have been Laura de Noves, but we are not entirely sure. Trying to answer this question, her tomb was dug up, and when it was opened, they discovered a lead box inside. Now, in the lead box was a medal that represented a woman ripping at her heart, and under the medal was a sonnet by Petrarch. Now, that seems pretty conclusive, but we have to remember that Petrarch's sonnets were circulated widely, and this Laura may have simply thought it was charming that Petrarch was writing to some other Laura, and it was just a coincidence. Either way, Laura was certainly an inspiration for Petrarch. Even after Laura's death, Petrarch continued to work on sonnets in her honor, writing 103 new sonnets. And then in 1341, while he's still in his 30s, remember, Petrarch is crowned Poet Laureate of Rome. Apparently, Paris offered to crown him their Poet Laureate as well, since he spent lots of time in France. But he decided that Rome was more proper, since he was born an Italian. Besides sonnets, he writes hundreds of letters that he collects into books. He also writes books on faith, including conversations with a character that he names Truth, and also he puts himself in conversation with saints, so old dead saints. He decides to write to them and invent their replies. And then he writes longer poems and meditations on humans reaching their potential. He does this because he's quite interested in the Greek and Roman writers, in humans developing their skills in logic and creativity, and he brings all of this into his contemporary time, which is the Renaissance. So the Renaissance is about to happen, and he is one of the people who brings alive these older Greek and Roman texts. And here we see Petrarch's handwriting. He's writing with a quill, and he's working on describing the life of one of the classical authors, Scipio. Here's a book page from an edition of Petrarch's work published in 1470. You can see how these pages are illuminated. They have all those colors and decorations on them. On July 19, 1374, right before he turns 70 years old, Petrarch is found dead by his daughter Francesca. He's slumped over his desk, working on another great piece of writing. And here's his tomb in Aqua Petrarcha. The town originally did not have his name at the end of it, but they added it on. And I should mention that he had this daughter, Francesca, out of wedlock because as a man of the church he was not allowed to marry, but he apparently had at least 2 children, perhaps by the same mother, perhaps not. But his daughter did find him when he died. Here is the village of Aqua Petrarcha and his house, and you can see where in Italy it is, kind of near Venice in northern Italy. Petrarch influenced countless writers of his own time, including his friend Boccaccio, who wrote the famous Decameron. It's a frame tale, which means that it has stories inside of stories. And then Petrarch's style inspires poets throughout the Renaissance. His use of enjambment, which means like continuing the sense of a sentence beyond the line break, and of course the sonnet itself. His humanist thinking ends the Dark Ages. Because he studies the Greek and Roman authors and revives interest in them, he's credited with starting the Renaissance, meaning starting interest in those works and the scholarship around those works. And of course, Shakespeare reads him 200 years later and writes many, many sonnets as well. Now, in later years, the English writers bring the sonnet to England and simplify the rhyme, because English doesn't have a lot of rhyming words the way other Latin-based languages do. Shakespeare writes his 156 sonnet sequence in the 1590s, but he also brings sonnets into his plays. Let's take a look at one that's hidden inside of Romeo and Juliet. Notice how Romeo is able to convince Juliet to kiss him with his clever wordplay. And also notice how this is a 14-line sonnet, even though each character takes some lines and then hands it off to the other. If I profane with my unworthiest hand this holy shrine, the gentle fine is this, my lips two blushing pilgrims ready stand to smooth that rough touch with a tender kiss. So he's saying if my hand is doing you some dishonor by touching it, well then my lips could just come in and fix that, you know, with that rough touch. I could just tenderly smooth that over with my lips. Juliet says, "Good pilgrim, you do wrong your hand too much, which mannerly devotion shows in this. For saints have hands that pilgrims' hands do touch, and palm to palm is holy Palmer's kiss." So she says, your hand is not doing anything bad. Don't wrong it. Don't insult your hand. Saints have hands, and praying is something that we do with our hands. Romeo says, "Have not saints lips, and holy Palmers too?" And she says, "I, pilgrim, lips that they must use in prayer." So you see how she's kind of pushing him back. And then he says, "Oh, then, dear saint, let lips do what hands do. Then pray, grant thou, lest faith turn to despair." So he wants the lips to touch the same way that hands touch in prayer. She says, "Saints do not move, though grant for prayer's sake. Then move not," says Romeo, "while my prayer's effect I take." So you see he's saying she is a saint, and she says, well, saints don't move, and he says, okay, well then don't move, and I'll just come to you, right? The prayer's effect I take. He moves to kiss her. Very clever. Now notice that Shakespeare's using all the sonnet tricks, iambic pentameter, rhythm, and rhyme. Now he's not the only one using the sonnet form. There's John Milton, John Donne with his holy sonnets, John Keats in the 1800s, and moving into the 20th century, Robert Frost, Edna St. Vincent Millay, and many others. There's a famous modern sonnet by Billy Collins that makes fun of Petrarch, in fact, and I believe it's just called Sonnet. You can check it out online. Now let's look at one final sonnet. This is by John Keats, and he lived right around 1800. This is Bright Star. Bright star, would I were steadfast as thou art, not in lone splendor hung aloft the night, and watching with eternal lids apart, like nature's patient, sleepless eremite, the moving waters at their priest-like task of pure ablution round earth's human shores, or gazing on the new soft-fallen mask of snow upon the mountains and the moors. No, yet steadfast, still, unchangeable, pillowed upon my fair love's ripening breast, to feel forever its soft fall and swell, awake forever in a sweet unrest, still, still to hear her tender taken breath, and so live ever, or else swoon to death. Now this is another love sonnet. It is in that tradition of Petrarch because of its subject matter, but notice how it's divided into 3 sets of 4 lines each. Those are quatrains, like the word quarter. Quatrain there in blue, quatrain in purple, quatrain in red, and then those last 2 lines that rhyme with each other, that is a couplet. And it's Shakespeare who brings the sonnet into this particular form, so this form is called a Shakespearean sonnet, the quatrains and couplet, whereas the other version is the Petrarchan, naturally. Both have the iambic pentameter, both have a strict rhyme scheme, and both are usually dealing with love and similar topics, those Petrarchan conventions that I listed. Now, if you're wondering what this poem is about, the star is a distant observer while the poet wants to be up close to the lover and lay his head on her chest and that sort of thing. And he wants to be as faithful as a star is, but closer and more intimate with his love. In fact, he says if he can't live like that, then he would rather swoon in death. Very romantic. All right, thank you, Francesco Petrach, for bringing us the sonnet, and also for letting love inspire you to write such wonderful poems. I hope you'll join me for another video sometime.